The coast roared, as if the world itself were crumbling. The wind was laden with salt and fury, whipping against the face and bringing the bittersweet smell of seaweed and blood. On the horizon, a liquid wall rose, taller than any castle, swallowing the sky and turning the sun into a pale specter. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 war drums beating simultaneously, drowning out even the clash of steel against steel. Swords flashed for an instant before disappearing into the foam, and the screams of men were lost in the relentless voice of the sea. If it were you, would you stay to fight or run, even knowing there was no solid ground to escape to? The protagonist stood there, the water already lapping at his ankles, feeling the ground tremble under the force of the approaching wave. Ahead of him, a war-scarred enemy advanced with blade in hand. Behind him, the tide surged like an eyeless, merciless beast. The metallic taste of fear rose in his throat, mixed with the salty taste the wind spat against his lips. It was as if the gods had unsheathed a sword made of water, ready to cut friend and foe with equal precision. The air smelled of wet earth and gunpowder, the mixture of battles and storms, and the weight of this choice fell upon his shoulders like sodden armor. But before the fury of the sea swallowed them, time seemed to hesitate. Just an instant, enough for his mind to be dragged back to the weeks leading up to that moment. It was a path of silent intrigue, averted glances in council meetings, sealed letters exchanging hands in the shadows, disputed lands, broken promises, vows of revenge uttered between sips of sake. The smell of burning incense in the temples mingled with that of blood spilled in the fields, and every step on this road led inevitably to that encounter before the wave. Now, there, the roar of the sea grew louder, pushing the present back into his chest. The enemy's blade gleamed in the gray light, and the sea roared behind, approaching too quickly. Perhaps, in the end, the war between men was but a whisper before the war that nature declared. Perhaps, in the end, they would all be on the same side, simply trying to survive the final blow of the sword of the gods. Would you, in his place, raise your sword? Or extend your hand? The fishing village was no longer a place of nets and quiet tides. It had become a maze of shattered beams and drifting corpses. Roofs floated like broken rafts, and the air reeked of wet wood, salt, and the faint copper sting of blood. Through the wreckage, two figures emerged from opposite ends of the main street, both moving with the slow, deliberate caution of predators who had once hunted each other. Their eyes locked, not in recognition of friendship, but in the instinctive recoil of sworn enemies. The rain slid down their faces like sweat in battle, and beneath the rushing water, each man's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his blade. The samurai code whispered in the mind like a ghost: an enemy is an enemy until the end. Yet here, the end was no longer a matter of steel, but of the sea's mercy. The water churned between them, carrying fragments of someone's home, someone's life. The current tugged at their feet, as if urging them to step forward or be pulled under. Every breath was a bargain. Each glance measured the distance to the other's throat. But beyond the hostility, a single truth lingered. Alone, neither would live to see the sun again. A section of a collapsing wall gave way behind one of them, the impact sending a shockwave through the flood. The other reached out without thinking, gripping the soaked sleeve of the man he had sworn to kill. For a heartbeat, they stood like that, suspended between death and survival, between honor and instinct. If you were there, would you let the enemy cling to your raft, knowing their blade once dripped with your clan's blood? Or would you push them back into the current and watch the river take them? The floodwater reached their knees now, thick with mud and debris, pulling at them with the strength of 100 unseen hands. The two samurai moved together through the wreckage, not because trust had bloomed between them, but because the sea allowed no other choice. Their movements were cautious, like two wolves circling the same fire, each close enough to share its warmth, yet ready to bare fangs if the other stepped too near. The rain blurred the line between sweat and fear, while under their soaked sleeves, fingers never strayed far from the cold comfort of steel. A broken cart drifted past, carrying the remnants of rice sacks and fishing nets. One samurai lunged to grab it, only to have the other's hand catch the same edge. For an instant, they locked eyes over the shared prize, supplies that could mean the difference between life and death. Without a word, they pulled it to higher ground together, each pretending not to notice the way the other's hand lingered near his blade. Even in this fragile alliance, betrayal sat in the air like the smell of rot. Every step through the flooded streets was a gamble. A beam might collapse without warning. A wave could return in an instant. They spoke little, but in the silence, the tension was deafening. The younger of the two finally broke it, voice low, as if afraid the water itself might hear. When this ends, do we walk away as allies or finish what we started? The older samurai's answer was a long glance, unreadable as the storm. And perhaps that was the bargain beneath the waves. Survival for now, war later. But would either live long enough to keep that promise? If this story moved you, imagine the ones still waiting to be told. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us in the forgotten silence of feudal Japan. History doesn't repeat itself, but it whispers. Don't miss the next echo. Through the veil of rain and drifting mist, they saw it. A lone temple perched on the slope above the shattered village, its tiled roof dark but intact, as if the sea's fury had chosen to spare it. The path to it was steep, slick with mud, and tangled with roots torn from the earth. Each step upward was a battle, their legs burning, the sound of rushing water still whispering behind them like a predator not yet finished with the hunt. When they reached the gates, they found them shut tight. From within came the muffled voices of the living, survivors huddled in the dark, their breath shallow with fear. Faces appeared in the gaps between the wooden slots, some pale with shock, others twisted with recognition and old hatred. Here, on this high ground, enemies and allies alike had gathered, pressed shoulder to shoulder by fate. But space was scarce, and the question burned hotter than the wet air in their lungs. Who deserved to be let in when shelter could not hold all? The older samurai stepped forward, rain dripping from the brim of his war hat. His voice cut through the patter of water. "We have children with us," he lied, knowing it might buy them entry. A murmur of distrust spread inside. Someone spat through the gap in the gate. "And tomorrow, when the sky clears, will you burn this temple as you burned our homes?" The words hung heavy. If it were you standing there, would you open the gates to those who once swore to kill you, or leave them to the sea's return? The temple loomed silent, its decision as still and heavy as the storm above. The air inside the temple was thick with incense and damp cloth, the mingled sense of prayer and survival. Yet even here, safety was a fragile illusion. The protagonist stood apart from the others, his hand still resting on the hilt of his sword, watching the enemy samurai across the room, a man whose face he knew from wanted scrolls and battlefield encounters. But now, that man knelt, clutching a child to his chest, the boy's skin pale from cold and fear. Outside, the rain eased, but the wind shifted, carrying the deep, rhythmic pulse of the ocean, a sound too steady, too heavy. Another wave was coming, a larger one. And in that moment, the enemy's eyes met his. No words were spoken, but the plea was clear: save him. Yet the cost was unbearable. Every moment spent rescuing the child would be a moment stolen from protecting his own people. His mind wrestled with Giri, the duty to his clan, and the code that bound his honor, and Ninjo, the compassion that threatened to break it. The enemy rose slowly, stepping closer, and from within his soaked armor, he pulled a small sealed packet. This, he whispered, could end the war, or set it ablaze again. But only if you choose. The words were heavy, sharp as steel, and they cut deeper than any blade. If it were you, would you risk your clan's survival to save the child of the man who once swore to kill you? Knowing that in your hands lies the power to decide the fate of the war itself. For a brief, fragile moment, the temple felt like a sanctuary. The wind eased, and the pounding in their ears faded to the steady drip of water from the rafters. Some dared to believe they had outrun the sea, but then came the sound, a low, unbroken rumble that seemed to rise from the bones of the earth itself. It was deeper than thunder, heavier than the clash of any army. The floor beneath them trembled, and every breath turned cold. The second wave announced itself with the shattering of the horizon. A wall of water, black with silt and broken by the jagged tips of uprooted trees, surged forward with a speed that mocked human legs. Panic fractured the uneasy alliance. Swords were drawn not at the ocean, but at each other, because in the face of death, old hatred was easier to cling to than hope. The protagonist moved to lead the survivors higher into the hills, but in the chaos, the enemy samurai stepped in front of him, the sealed packet in his hand now torn open, revealing words that could burn through years of bloodshed. The truth spilled out like oil on water, impossible to gather again. Betrayal and revelation struck in the same heartbeat, and the fragile bridge of trust collapsed. But it was too late to turn back. The wave roared into the temple, swallowing walls and bodies alike. The sea tore away everything, weapons, oaths, grudges, until only the weight of the truths revealed remained. And as the ocean closed over them, it was clear, it was not the water that would haunt them, but the choices made in its shadow. The sea receded slowly, as if reluctant to release its claim. What remained was a world stripped bare, splintered beams tangled with fishing nets, armor pieces glinting dully under the pale light, and the still forms of men who hours ago had sworn to kill each other. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, and the silence felt heavier than the roar that had preceded it. Among the survivors, eyes met without words. Some searched the horizon for answers, others stared at their own trembling hands. Was this devastation the wrath of the gods punishing their endless cycle of vengeance? Or had the ocean offered them a chance to bury their blades, to rise from the flood as something more than enemies? The question lingered, unspoken yet undeniable. The protagonist stood apart, drenched and unsteady, the memory of the enemy's child's face still sharp in his mind. His armor felt heavier than stone, not from the water, but from the weight of decisions made in the dark. If survival demanded the breaking of the samurai code, could such a life still be called honorable? He turned away from the shore, stepping into the mist that clung to the hills. The sea had erased the land, yet it was the choices of men that had truly reshaped the shore. Somewhere deep inside, he knew the wave had not ended when the water withdrew. It lived on in every heart it had touched.